lecture on a domestic topic, on a very important topic about domestic politics and China's political situation under Xi Jinping. A few words about our speaker. Professor Andrew Nathan is class of 1919, professor of political science at Columbia University. He has a BA, MA, and PhD from Harvard, where he studied with a great American historian on China, John King Fairbank. He has been at Columbia University since 1971, where he served as a chair of the Department of Political Science, of the Executive Committee of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and as a director of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, among other posts. The teaching and research interests of Professor Nathan include Chinese politics and foreign policy, the comparative study of political participation and political culture, and human rights. Now, Professor Nathan's work has had a profound impact for many decades on how we understand and how we talk about China within academia and in the policy field. So without further delay, Professor Nathan, it's a great honor to have you with us today. So I hope the slides are ready. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I see that some of you are back, having been here yesterday. So I appreciate the fact that you came back. And I again apologize for those of you who weren't here yesterday. I apologize for my voice problem, but I got something in my throat. But Costas and Electra and others are taking good care of me. I have my hot tea, so I believe I'll be fine. So today's lecture is about China's domestic situation, and the title is China under Xi Jinping. And the question is, which China is it? So Xi Jinping says that we're building the China dream. We're going to be a major power, and we're going to be a modern middle-class country. And so the picture on the left is not Xi Jinping's own picture, but my one I got off the internet that I imagine is something of what he envisions life in China will be like after the China dream has been constructed, the many generations together, implementing the Confucian morals, but also drinking fresh French wine and freshly squeezed orange juice and having an upper middle class life. But there's also another China that we have seen, which is symbolized here by the white paper movement. So as you know, when COVID started up in China, the government adopted a strict control policy to prevent the spread of COVID. And it came to the place where there were extensive lockdowns of urban neighborhoods or whole cities where people were told, you can't go out of your apartment, we will deliver your food. And if anybody tried to get out of their apartment, they would be stopped by anonymous people in hazmat suits. And if anybody tested positive, or if their phone indicated that they had been near somebody who had been tested positive, people could be coercively taken to large sort of warehouses of beds where they were isolated and quarantined. And if people went to China, you would be in quarantine for 2 or 2.5 weeks. I had a Chinese student who went back in the late period of COVID to do research. She arrives in Shanghai and she's quarantined, and then she goes to her family in Wuhan and she's quarantined in Wuhan, and then she goes to Beijing to do the research. She basically wasted her whole summer in quarantine. And then this led in 2022 to a protest movement in which people went out on the street, and many of them just held up blank paper. And some of them have signs, and they're saying, bring an end to this policy. You're controlling us too much. The police surrounded these people. They were quickly dispersed. The most famous incident was in Shanghai, but it happened in many other cities as well. So the question is, are the Chinese people so dissatisfied that they're at the edge of their tolerance? And go to the next slide. So I wanted to bring in a little bit of my personal history with China because I think it's interesting in the context of this puzzle. In 1988 summer, I had an opportunity to visit China, and I had a friend there who he's retired now, but he was a researcher in the Henan Province Academy of Social Sciences. And he and I would go around and he would call up local units and say, there's a professor from America who wants to visit your unit. I'm from the Henan Academy of Social Science, and I'm bringing this person around. So it seemed very official to the local people. And they would have me come and they would give me a briefing, what was called the Zhendan Jieshao, a simple briefing, while my friend would walk along with those other people who were accompanying us and interview them, what's really going on. And then he and I would exchange information afterward. And I came back and wrote this article. So when I tell people I could tell there was something wrong in 1988, I have proof of that because it happened to be that I published an article in early 1989. In those days, the Asia Society in New York would publish an annual report on China called China Briefing. And so their China Briefing 1989 was about articles about society, economy, and so forth and so on in the previous year. So I published this thing in the early 1989 in which I wrote these sentences. In 1988, I said, ushered in a season of discontent that is perhaps unique in China's post-revolutionary history. The mood among intellectuals in particular reflected a profound questioning not only of China's political leaders and political system, but even of its national culture and national character. So there were intellectuals who were saying, we have to get rid of our national culture and our slave-like authoritarian national personality. There were intellectuals who were writing this kind of thing and even putting it on television. I don't know if any of you remember a series called He Shang. I forget now the translation of the Song of the River. Yeah, the River Elegy, which was put on official Chinese television, talking about traditional Chinese culture of the Yellow River and how we need to go to the Blue Ocean. And it's talking about we have to get rid of our, peasant traditions and westernize. This was on public TV. Some viewed the increasing social disorder and intellectual alienation as signs of a dangerous breakdown of the social contract. So I could tell something was wrong from speaking with people. And what happened next was, next slide, was the famous pro-democracy movement that started in April 15th, 1989, a student hunger strike. The regime was under threat. The Politburo Standing Committee was split. One faction said the students are patriotic and they're opposed to corruption and we should we should negotiate with them and tell them we're going to fix these problems and then they'll peacefully disperse. And another faction said that if we allow independent, and it was only students because as this movement built up and the students went into a hunger strike, other people came out to join them, including many Communist Party members and government officials from Beijing. There was a parade. There was a group from, for example, from the People's Daily, which is the official Chinese Communist Party newspaper. And the other faction said, if we allow this chaos to happen, they're actually blaming Deng Xiaoping, who is the supreme leader, then Communist Party, the principle of Communist Party rule in which we have one party that leads and it's centralized is finished. We'll have a chaotic society. And it ended, as you all know, with the top leader, Deng Xiaoping, making the decision to crack down. Because at that time, they didn't have a well-trained paramilitary force they have now, but did not then. They called in the People's Liberation Army, which is equipped with tanks and rifles and trained for mortal combat, which came in to Tiananmen Square, came down through the streets of Beijing, shooting at apartment buildings and killed a number of people in Tiananmen Square. And we don't know the number to this day. There are all kinds of different numbers out there. I did not foresee, nobody foresaw that this event would take place, but I did feel that something was happening. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, actually, if we put the cursor on the slide and then, yeah, okay, yeah. So the regime did not collapse in 1989. Many of us, most of us who were China specialists, we sort of thought, okay, this is the end of the Chinese regime, communist regime, and something else is going to happen, but that did not occur. And instead, Deng Xiaoping stayed in control, and in 1992, he told the leadership, we must continue the reform and opening policy. The 1990s were a period of tremendous economic growth, double-digit economic growth. The leadership in that time, Jiang Zemin and followed by Hu Jintao, were not particularly tough, but neither did they face. So what they had was a kind of collective leadership, and various top leaders controlled various aspects of government and economy and security, and they all worked together. Corruption flourished, economic growth flourished. China's relations with the United States were good because China was not challenging the United States at that time. And in the United States, we began to think that China would modernize and would come to love us. I talked about this yesterday. And in 2003, I was swimming at the YMCA. No, I swim on my back, and I was thinking, you know, you think when you swim, either that or you listen to jazz. And I was sort of thinking, oh, it's 2003, and the Chinese Communist Party has not collapsed the way I thought they were going to do in 1989. Sometimes I'm a little slow. I'm like, why has the regime not collapsed? And nobody has written about this. So I came back and I wrote this article, which has gotten a lot of attention and has become a sort of slogan, authoritarian resilience. So nowadays, you know, 2024, people will write articles that say, was Nathan wrong about authoritarian resilience? What I wasn't predicting. I always answer these things saying, I wasn't predicting that the regime would survive forever, so I can't be wrong now. I was just analyzing why it hadn't collapsed. And I think I had 4 reasons, as I remember, for this. And the primary reason was most authoritarian regimes collapse because of a succession struggle. And they didn't have a succession struggle. And why didn't they have it? Well, Deng Xiaoping chose Jiang Zemin as the successor, and he also chose the successor to Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao. And so when I wrote about this, I was writing about that. They also had a rising economy, and they also had effective propaganda and repression techniques. And they also had a certain amount of what I called safety valve institutions, so that dissatisfied people in China did have an opportunity to demonstrate in a small scale of demonstration, and usually the leader would be arrested, but some concessions would be made. They had an appeal procedure where people could write their complaints and expose corrupt cadres and things of that kind. And then when we got to 2012, the succession again went relatively smoothly. There was a competition among 3 leaders. One of them was Xi Jinping. The second one was Li Keqiang, who became the premier. The third one was Bo Xilai, who was very, very prominent, energetic, charismatic leader who was the provincial party secretary of the provincial level city of Chongqing. But Bo Xilai, luckily for Xi, and so there could have been a succession struggle. But then this amazing event took place where the police chief of Bo Xilai's operation fled to the American consulate general in the nearby city of Chengdu and said that Bo Xilai's wife was the person who had arranged the murder of a British businessman who had been her consultant. This story is a wonderful story, and there are a lot of more details I don't have time to tell, but the upshot was that Bo Xilai was arrested. His wife was arrested. They were both sentenced to long jail terms, and I've asked friends of mine, is Bo Xilai actually still in jail? Because sometimes Chinese leaders will be sentenced to a jail term and then they'll be paroled out to house arrest and golf courses and things like that. But apparently Bo Xilai is still in jail. And Xi Jinping became the top leader without any real competition because the other guy, Li Keqiang, didn't really have a power base, and he became the premier. And Xi Jinping turned out to be a very tough leader. He instituted a wide-ranging anti-corruption campaign in which he purged top generals, top security officials, thousands, tens of thousands of officials, all up and down the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state. He also, and this was partly an anti-corruption campaign, and it was partly a factional purge. As he did this, he consolidated his own power. After 2 terms in office, which has become the normal number of terms for a Chinese party secretary. It wasn't under Mao. Mao served, well, he didn't have any terms of office. He served until his death. But after Mao's death, the informal norm emerged of party general secretaries serving for 2 terms. It's not in the party charter, but it was a norm. But after 2 terms, Xi Jinping had himself elected for a 3rd term, which he is serving currently. And this is a picture of the Political Bureau Standing Committee. Excuse me. And all of these people are Xi Jinping's close loyalists. They came up through the system with him. They served with him. They're loyal to him. They believe in him. I don't think there's an ongoing debate about whether the Chinese Communist Party is still factionalized, as it was under Mao, and it was under Deng Xiaoping, and it was before Xi Jinping. And we don't know, because if there's an opposition faction to Xi Jinping, it's invisible. It may exist. It's human nature. So we may think it must be there. But what we know about these top people is that they are not only came up with Xi Jinping and were chosen by Xi Jinping, but they truly believe. I think we know that. We don't really know much about their inner thinking. We know very little. But that they truly believe that the Xi Jinping line, which is a distinctive line, it's re-emphasizing state control over the economy, including state control over the private enterprises. It emphasizes ideological discipline. It emphasizes a tradition of what's called party life, where members of the Chinese Communist Party have to really study the works of Xi Jinping and really be loyal and really obey the orders from the party central. And internationally, as I said last night, Xi Jinping's line is assertive. It's like, we're going to challenge the United States now. Now is the time to do so. And he seems also to control the military and the security agencies. And it seems there's a discussion about whether or not there could be a coup d'etat against Xi Jinping. I don't think first of all, that there's any reason for a coup d'etat. The military is being supported in its buildup. He has purged a lot of generals for corruption, but they're gone, and his own people are in charge. But if somebody wants to do a coup d'etat, and there have been some things like coup d'etats in the history of the Chinese Communist Party, which mostly failed. For example, the attempt by Lin Biao to overthrow Mao, and that failed. Or the arrest of the Gang of Four, which was a kind of a coup d'etat after the death of Mao. If anybody wanted to do that, it would be very difficult because the regime has a series of coup-proofing norms and rules so that leaders, powerful people cannot meet together secretly. All of their meetings have to be with permission of the party general office, and their own staffs report to the party general office. So I don't know how a coup could be secretly arranged. So the regime of Xi Jinping appears to be in firm control. And yet you have various signs. If I were back in China today, would I or would I not feel the way I felt in 1988? And I don't go to China because I can't get a visa to China for various reasons. The main reason is a book that I published in 2001 called the Tiananmen Papers. If you want to talk about that in Q&A, we can. So I don't get to go to China, but I do get to speak to a lot of Chinese people. And I have to be careful, skeptical, because the people I talk to are sort of a self-selected group. And then I have American friends who do visit China. And there's an active debate among Chinese and among American and Western China specialists about whether or not China is in or is entering into another sort of 1988, 1989 moment. The challenges to the regime that we know about start with a slowdown in the economy. So the COVID crackdown caused a slowdown in the Chinese economy, but it's more than that. It's also that the economic strategy that the regime pursued for a long time of investment in infrastructure, allowing the development of a very, very large leveraged real estate industry where they were building huge numbers of real estate towers. That real estate industry has basically gone bankrupt. Just this week or last week, the Chinese government announced a rescue plan for the real estate industry, which has to do with the government purchasing a lot of these empty apartments. And nobody knows how well that rescue plan is going to work, but it will probably cause a decline in the value of the apartments that people invested in. And so for many years, the World Bank and others have said to the Chinese government that you cannot continue double-digit. In fact, they've already ceased double-digit economic growth before the COVID crackdown. The economy was slowing down, but the economic growth was dependent to a considerable degree on exports, partly exports to the consumer markets of the United States and the EU, partly exports of construction services and construction equipment through the Belt and Road Initiative. And economists have said you've got to develop a consumption-driven economy. But the transition from this state-controlled, export-driven economy to a consumption-driven economy is extremely difficult. And I'm not an economist, so I don't exactly understand the reason why, but I think it has to do with the economic part of it has to do with the government losing control of a lot of money as that money goes into the hands of consumers who will then have power through their money and will drive the economy in directions that the government may feel are not its priority. And politically, that's risky for the government because it means that power goes into the hands of private enterprises and consumers. So they haven't been, I'm sure there's more than that, but as I'm not an economist, I don't have a full grasp of why it's so difficult, but they have not chosen to do so. Xi Jinping has not chosen so far to go in the direction of a consumer-driven economy. Another reason why it's difficult, it's part of what I said before, but to clarify, it would require the construction of a very expensive social welfare system. They have a social welfare system, but it's a relatively inexpensive one. And it doesn't encourage consumers to spend money because they have to save. And if you try to build a really adequate social welfare system, it'd be very, very expensive. I don't know where the government would get that money from. So as the economy goes down, there are some responses to this by members of the public that could be threatening to the regime, that could be similar to 1988. I'm not saying it is similar to 1988, but it could be that way. So one thing that's very publicly popular in China is this idea of tangping, of lying flat, which is that people stop working hard because it's pointless to work hard. And one of the places where this is also very conspicuous is in the party and state bureaucracy, where the bureaucrats have been under so much pressure to keep in line with the top leadership. It's very dangerous to make a mistake. It's not so dangerous to do nothing. So the bureaucracy is becoming very passive, and people in the economy are young people who can't find jobs because there's a high rate of youth unemployment, are also saying, okay, I can't find a job, so I'm just going to give up, live with my parents. So this is this phenomenon called tangping. There's also a phenomenon called runxue, which is a pun, which is the study of run, and run is spelled in pinyin R-O-N. There's a trend of emigration from China, people saying, I want to get out of here. Some of them do so by applying to, if they have enough money, to education programs overseas and then trying to stay overseas. Others are actually coming into the United States. It's not only people from Central America, Nicaraguans, Guatemalans, not only people from Haiti, not only people from Afghanistan and Syria that are crossing the southern border and creating this sort of Donald Trump phenomenon of alien invasion. It's also Chinese now who are coming across the southern border who have found a way to get to South America and then to come up the southern border. So this is quite, just distressing phenomenon for those of us who love China. Another challenge to the regime are the national minorities. China has, as you know, 55 officially recognized national minorities, some of whom are very small and present no challenge to the stability of the regime. But as I said last night, thank you so much. The Uyghur population, which is in the big green area, there are 12 Muslim, of the 55 national minorities, 12 of them are groups that believe in Islam. And one of those groups, called the Hui, H-U-I, are quite heavily assimilated into the majority population who are ethnically designated as Han. All of these ethnic designations are kind of a myth. There's no really such thing as the Han. I mean, the Han themselves are a mix of all kinds of different languages and local cultures, but they're called the Han and they believe themselves to be the Han. The Hui look like Han people. They mostly behave like Han people. That's also true of, for example, the Manchu group. It's fully assimilated. But the other 11 Islamic groups are not assimilated, but many of them are very small. The largest of them are the Uyghurs. The number two group are the Kazakhs. And these two groups and some of the other ones live in this green area. They are not happy with the way they've been treated by the People's Republic of China in a bunch of ways. I don't have time to describe them. And so the government under Xi Jinping has decided to solve this problem across the generations by bringing an estimated over 1 million of the adults of the Uyghurs into these re-education camps and to train their children in residential schools where they lose their advanced command of their own language and religion and become secularized. This program seems to be working, seems to be effective. It's drawn tremendous criticism from the outside world, from the human rights world, Europe and the United States, but not from the other Islamic countries, because the other Islamic countries have important equities with China. They've just, including Turkey, the Uyghurs are ethnically Turkic. Their language is a form of Turkish, as is their religion. Turkey hasn't said anything about it. The other group in the yellow part of the map are the Tibetans, and they also are not happy. And the regime has also tried to secularize the Tibetans, to modernize the Tibetans, to get them out of what the regime regards as their superstitious and backward way of life. This is, it seems to me, not succeeding that well, actually. The Tibetan population is very, very loyal to their own religion, yellow sect Buddhism. So from an analysis of domestic Chinese politics, thinking about, is it a 1988 moment or not in China, these ethnic minorities cannot overthrow the regime. They're much too small and marginal, but they do present a controlled challenge to the regime that is very difficult. Now let's go to the next slide. The other colors on the map are the other smaller minorities, and they really don't present that kind of challenge. Now, if you remember on my first slide, I had this happy family drinking the French wine. And this is the success of Chinese modernization and double-digit economic growth and the increase in the higher education establishment. I think China has something like 2,000 universities and colleges now. Is that right? Yeah, you know, and they have a huge college-educated population. The downside of modernization is, so I took this picture off the internet, which is kind of an exaggeration of the young Chinese middle class. I mean, most young Chinese middle class are not that slick, not that smooth, you know, but so I'm exaggerating with this particular choice of a graphic. But it is true that as you modernize, the values of the society do undergo change. So in American political science in the 1950s invented this theory called modernization theory. And modernization theory said all of the world is going to become like the United States. They're all going to industrialize, and then they're all going to want to be democratic. And those parts of modernization theory, part of it was true. The world wants to be wealthy. And China didn't become wealthy under Mao for many years, but it is now becoming middle class. The Chinese middle class, nobody knows the exact number, and it depends on the definition, is probably around 400,000 people. It's a large middle class. They live in cities, they own apartments, they own automobiles, they travel to New York. They have tour groups that come to the Columbia campus. When I arrived at the airport in Athens, luckily I got in ahead of the plane that came from China, but behind me, there was a long, long line of Chinese tourists arriving in Athens. And as this happens, I'm part of a survey research project called the Asian Barometer Survey. And I did these data from the wave 3 China data from 2011. I don't know if you can read the note under the slide, and the wave 4 data from 2014 to 2016 combined with 7,500 respondents. So it's a pretty good survey, I think, although the quality of surveys in China, there's also a debate. Everything about China, there's a debate. And we have a battery in the questionnaire called liberal democratic values. Do you think that the legislature should check the executive? Do you think that courts should be independent? Things like this. And we find that the Chinese population in general is relatively conservative and traditional. We have another battery called traditional social values. The question there that I love is, should students respect their professor? And unfortunately, the Chinese population is not unanimous on that. There's division. But what we find is males are more liberal democratic. That's not too unusual. And the correlation coefficient is not very big. But younger people, there's a large correlation coefficient of 0.289, counts as a big number in survey research with 3 asterisks. It's highly statistically significant. Younger people are more liberal democratic. Urban residents are more liberal democratic. More educated people are highly more liberal democratic. And then we find, and those with more social capital, with richer social networks, but then we find as well that those who are more liberal democratic have lower levels of social trust, lower levels of trust in the Chinese media, lower levels of trust in government effectiveness, much lower levels of trust in government fairness, lower levels of national pride. So the challenge to the regime is, as you succeed in your task of the China dream, and you make the living standard go up, and you build a bigger middle class, that middle class is not as loyal to the regime as the old peasant and worker class was. Now, that doesn't mean that they're disloyal to the regime. It doesn't mean necessarily that the middle class is going to rise up and overthrow Xi Jinping, which is, of course, the dream of American engagement policy and modernization theory. Why is that? I wrote an article called The Puzzle of the Chinese Middle Class, where I tried to analyze this question. First of all, as I said, the middle class is still a minority in China. 400,000 is a lot of people, but among 1.4 billion people, it's a minority. They're surrounded by 1 billion people who are poorer than they are, and they want stability. They have their apartment, they have their automobile, they don't want chaos. They look around, who is providing stability? Xi Jinping is providing it. Life in China is very, very safe. The parks in the cities are really nice. The retired people ride on public transportation for free. They have an adequate urban people, retired people who worked for the government or worked for a state-owned enterprise, so not everybody, has an adequate retirement pension. Don't rock the boat. That's one thing. Another thing is, it's not that easy to jump the Great Firewall and read the website of the New York Times or, website of human rights groups and stuff like that. So they mainly are exposed to government information, which is pro-China information. We can call it propaganda if we want to, but let's just say government information, most of which is information, but it's pro-China information. Number 3, they are proud of their country. Why not? China has achieved all of these great things. Now I'm Chinese. I can travel to New York. I can walk up and down Fifth Avenue and buy stuff in the Louis Vuitton store that you poor American professors cannot buy, stuff like that. So they are they're proud. Why it's reasonable to be. So these younger people are less proud, but it doesn't mean that the middle class as a whole is ashamed of anything. And finally, they know very well that they are under surveillance. They know that the small number of people who, for example, came out in the white paper movement were quickly detained. They were that those who were really persistent dissidents will be sentenced. You know, they know that going up against the government, you're isolated. If you remember the way in which communism collapsed in Eastern Europe, it was a large number of people came out all of a sudden. It was a sort of a cascade. It was a runaway phenomenon. So those people who were relatively cautious and conservative saw that everybody is out in the street now. I'm not going to be arrested. I'm just in the mass. Well, that trigger movement where everybody is out in the street may happen sometime. It happened in 1989. But who's the first person to go out in the street? So that's another reason why the middle class is not yet ready, if they're ever going to be ready, to go out in the street. In addition to that, let's see what we have next. I think I updated. Yeah. In addition to that, China faces some long-term risk factors. Am I on time? I'm near the end. That are well known, but to which the government, which could cause a crisis, and the government doesn't have, any more than our government, have a sort of a magic bullet to solve these problems. One of them is that China has a gigantic population, and it has a water shortage. It has a severe water shortage in the north, a less severe water shortage in the south. The water for central China and South China comes from the melting of the glaciers in Tibet. Those glaciers are melting very fast because of climate change. And they have a south to north water canal system. But I don't know what the long-term answer is to China's water shortage any more than we know what the long-term answer is to the droughts in California, to the droughts that are emerging in other places. And that could, I mean, we can imagine tragedies that could be caused in food supply and public health. China used to be completely self-sufficient in food, but they've become importers of food supplies. Then they have the climate change problem. Now, this map that I took from the UN is a refugee map. But what it really is trying to say is, where is the impact of climate change going to be the most? I mentioned drought, but there's also the rising oceans. And coastal China is where the majority of the population lives and the majority of industry is located. And as the oceans rise, as is true in the United States, for example, in Miami, where my daughter went to college, and I told her, don't go to college there because Miami will disappear. But she went and graduated, it's still there. So, but, you know, so China will be among them, according to the UN, among the countries most severely affected for all of these different reasons by climate change, including this map, including drought, including presumably disease vectors, including potentially shortage of food supply. And how do you handle that? So China is actually doing a better job than the United States in transitioning to a green economy. That's one of the reasons why they're ahead of us in EVs, and causing the United States to then introduce protectionist measures against Chinese EVs, and putting pressure on the EU to also put protectionist measures on Chinese EVs, which is causing friction between China, the US, and the EU. But at the same time, though, because they have to supply their population and their industry with energy, and the energy needs are growing. Simultaneously, they continue to invest in new coal power plants. The third problem is population. China had a one-child policy for a long time in the post-Mao period, and that has led to a Chinese population structure which is already overbalanced to the elderly, non-working population, and they haven't changed the retirement age. This is something that is so puzzling to me. The retirement age for most Chinese women is 55, am I right? And 60 for men. It's crazy. And why they don't change it? I don't understand. Because do they think that the people over the age of 60 would be angry about being required to continue to work? I suppose that's the argument. I don't know. But India has a much more typical, healthy population structure. Other countries in Asia, South Korea, Japan, also have very serious problems of population structure. China has now introduced pro-natalist policies encouraging women to stay home, raise children, have a second child. These do not seem to be working. Okay, let's go to the next. So my conclusion, much more could be said, but my conclusion for now is, well, I think we should draw a conclusion that's not on this slide, which is that based upon the early slides in my presentation, China always surprises us. Our record of predicting when is something going to happen in China is like 0%, unless you count my article from 1988, which I didn't really predict what was going to happen. So here, nonetheless, here is my assessment of China today. The regime, we're concerned here, the question that I'm posing is, will the regime face a regime-threatening crisis? So I'm not saying China is strong but brittle as a country. I'm saying the current regime is strong. The Xi Jinping regime is strong. They have economic growth. Do they have economic growth, actually? So they report 5.2% economic growth. I have friends, Chinese friends. For example, one of my Chinese friends is the chief economist of the Hang Seng Bank in Shanghai. She's there. She sees everything. She says, it's true. I have another friend who's a Chinese economist at Stanford University called Xu Chengguang. He says, it's all fake. The economy is 0%. I don't know. So I'm putting economic growth in the column and I'll say, okay, something's happening. The economy is growing. That's good for the regime. Xi Jinping has a disciplined, controlled ruling party, 100 million members. They all obey him. Xi Jinping controls the propaganda system. The public has nationalism. They're proud. The public knows that there are cameras everywhere. Your internet is surveilled. The police are everywhere. Coup-proofing. That's a strong regime. I don't see a threat to that regime. On the other hand, it could change very easily. This is not a regime with that could survive a mass challenge of some kind, though they have. They've survived the earthquake in Sichuan. They survived the COVID lockdown. They survived a variety of scandals, the melamine milk scandal, the consumer products, various consumer product scandals. They survived their own corruption crisis, which Xi Jinping has brought down a lot. But the weak points are the economy is slowing. The single point of failure is Xi Jinping. He makes all of the strategic decisions. My own assessment is he's made effective strategic decisions in his first 12 years in office, by and large. Some were mistakes. But in general, I believe Xi Jinping is pretty smart. But at any moment, he could make a wrong decision. Mao made many wrong decisions. A third point is Xi Jinping has not named a successor, nor has anybody emerged that we can see from the outside has consolidated any kind of power base. If Xi Jinping, who's now 71 years old, remains in good health, as he stays in office until he decides to retire, maybe at the age of 81, not 81, he would be retiring at the age of, he would be retiring in 2012, 2022. You do the math. After serving in office for 20 years, I can't do math while I talk, or when I don't talk either. If he retires by plan, he can name a successor if he wants to do so. But if something happens to him, there could be a power struggle. I wouldn't anticipate a day two power struggle. Somebody the number two person would come into office. They have rules for these things. But that person would not have consolidated power. And then a factionalism would reemerge and there would be a challenge. The legitimacy that I mentioned before is not a faith. I explained the legitimacy, economic growth, nationalism, propaganda, and so forth. It's not a faith in Xi Jinping, the theory of Xi Jinping socialism for the new era. It's not a faith in the Communist Party rule. It's not a faith in the idea. Some Chinese have this feeling. Democracy is actually not a good system. You look at the United States, it's a mess. Our system is better. But most Chinese people don't seem to have that feeling. Our system works, we have it, but it's not necessarily the best kind of system in the world. So I call that shallow legitimacy. And then there is the continuing cultural self-doubt that occurred in 1980, in the 80s, about is Chinese civilization too backward, too collectivist, too traditional, too deferential to authority, is a debate that goes on in China. It's a debate with two sides. And finally, the fact that the regime relies so much on repressive measures is the best evidence that they know that there's a lot of latent resistance and risk to them. And as we saw in East Germany, for example, in 1989, that repressive measures work until they don't work anymore. So I think the regime is very strong, but I don't feel that it is entrenched in a way that it can survive some kind of crisis. I don't know what kind of crisis that will be, and I don't know how soon it will happen. So let me stop there and ask for your comments and questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Nathan. I will open the floor to questions straight away. Yes, please.
The BRI? Yeah. I think that as in most countries, most of the Chinese population doesn't know a lot about foreign affairs. And as far as I don't actually know the answer to your second question about their view on the BRI. I know that there are some Chinese intellectuals, but I believe they're a small minority who say, why are we sending all of this money overseas? I think most people understand little about it, and they understand that China has growing respect and influence in the world, and that's a good thing. And the Chinese official story, which makes sense to a lot of Chinese people, is that we, as China, are part of the developing world. We're unselfish. We're helping the developing world. and we're proud of that. On the thing about Taiwan, I believe that there is some division in the Chinese public about this, because there is a strong view that Taiwan belongs to China. And from a legal and historical point of view, that is a strong argument. I'm not trying to make a judgment. I'm not an international judge. But there is a strong argument that Taiwan was historically a part of China, not always, but historically after the Qing dynasty took it over. It was invaded and colonized by Japan, and after Japan was defeated, it reverts to the control of China, and there's no way that it belongs to the United States. That argument makes sense to a lot of Chinese people, just like that. And so, yes, we should have Taiwan. But then if you change the question and say, should we have a war over Taiwan? A lot of Chinese people are not, there is a strong sort of militarist voice in Chinese public opinion on social media. Let's attack right away. The Americans are weak. They'll, we're strong. It's an outrage and so forth. There are a lot of people on social media with this kind of militarist voice, but I think there are also a lot of Chinese people who are like, life is pretty good as it is, the way I was describing it, and we don't need a war. And especially we don't need a war with the Americans, because somehow, and this is without understanding the technology, somehow there's the view that the Americans, which I think is actually correct, that the Americans have fearsome secret military technologies and it would be a disaster. I think it's true that American military technology that would be brought to bear in a Taiwan contingency, a lot of it is secret or classified, and that it's very advanced, and that and then to answer your question, if China did get into a war with the United States and were to lose that war, that probably is the type of crisis that could lead to an overthrow of the Chinese leadership. But who would overthrow them? Who would succeed the Chinese leadership? There isn't anybody except members of the Chinese Communist Party and military elite who could take power. You're not going to have some dissident I have a former student of mine named Wang Juntao, who runs a political party in New York called the China Democracy Party. And Juntao thinks he will return to China like Sun Yat-sen did and take over the government. I don't believe that. He has no power base there. So you would have sort of Chinese Xi Jinping number 2, I think would be the successor. Would they be liberals? Would they be fascists? We don't know what they would be. I don't know. Is it true that the younger generation are spenders? I don't know that. I'm not saying you're wrong. I just don't know that for sure. But I think even the younger generation, when they get married and have children, I would think, somebody tell me who knows, would be savers, because you have, even though there's not a one-child policy, most people are having one child. That child will hopefully get married. That couple will, one hopes, have 4, parents-in-law, and will not be able to support their parents-in-law. And if you have an adequate pension, because you were a state employee or state enterprise employee, then you'll be safe. But also there are healthcare costs. I think that people, when they get a little older and have a family, are also going to be savers. And so all of this saved money is in the control of the state-owned banking system, and then the state decides where to invest it. That's just what I know. I'm not an economist, so I don't want to say that you're wrong. And then I forgot your second question, but maybe it's just as well. Oh. Oh, yeah. I think they're quite interested in, many of them are interested in Christianity and Buddhism and Taoism. There's quite a fad of Tibetan Buddhism among the Han population and so forth, but it's not like they're interested in those religious communities that are forbidden by the government. You know, China has, I could have had a slide on this, estimated 100 million underground Christians, Protestants and Catholics, who belong to independent Protestant and Catholic churches and communities that the government doesn't approve of and doesn't control. And in politics, I think it's because they understand that politics is banned for them. And it's dangerous, but their consumer life and their private life is open. And the younger generation are experiencing, many times they're the first generation with a middle-class life. Their parents were workers, their parents were farmers, their parents were poor. And now I come along, I get a college education, I get a salary job. I begin to live a middle-class life. Being the first generation to live a middle-class life is a kind of a learning project. It's a life project, how to be middle-class. And I think it's a very exciting project. It's a thrilling project. So people are invested in that project.
I would also like to encourage female participation in questions. Okay.
The Chinese Communist Party principle for running the system, whether it's China or any other Leninist party state, is that there's one organization that controls the whole society. And then at the bottom level, there may be some independent organizations that are local only, and then not cross province, not national. So they see the Catholic Church, so there is one Catholic denomination that's run by the Religious Affairs Bureau of the Chinese Communist Party. So that means that that's part of the Communist Party system. The Communist Party has the Religious Affairs Bureau that controls Catholicism, Protestantism, Islam, Buddhism, and Taoism, 5 permitted religions. But then there are uncontrolled expressions of all of those religions, especially Catholicism and Protestantism, not so much the others. And they're quite large populations. So about the Catholic Church, well, there are two things. Actually, it's true of both Catholic and Protestant. They're large national groups that are independent of the Chinese Communist Party. So the party doesn't control them. And that could lead to trouble. And they are influenced by foreign forces. In the case of Catholic, the Holy See, that's very clear. In the case of the Protestants, it's murky, but international Protestantism historically has had an interest in Chinese Protestantism, depending, though, this is a little complicated because international Protestantism sometimes considers the Chinese Protestant sects to be not real Protestantism. You know, then they're not interested in them. So it's a combination of large independent organization and foreign influence. The discipline of the party on Xi Jinping is that every party member needs to study the things that Xi Jinping has, the written work of Xi Jinping, which is his writings, which are not, presumably not all written, or maybe none of them written by him actually, but by his staff, and his speeches, which are, some of them are limited to circulation within the party and some are public. You have to study those things and master them all the time, and maintain unanimity with the party center in all things, so that when you are let's say, mayor of a certain city, and you have a problem of garbage pickup or trying to attract investment or whatever your work is as a mayor, you need to do that work in consistency with the philosophy of Xi Jinping. Your term in office as a mayor may be 3 to 5 years. If you want to be, and your work will be inspected by teams coming down from the personnel department of the next level up, and they will come in and see what you've done, look at your statistics, interview people in the city, interview the other officials that you work with, interview the retired officials that live in that city, and find out whether you've done everything in consistency with Xi Jinping's thought for socialism in the new era. And that thought for socialism in the new era is constantly evolving because, of course, the situation evolves and the government has to guide people as to what is the new situation. So that's what I meant. So all of these people from the top to the bottom are supposed to study what comes out of the party center and behave accordingly. Female participation. All right. Yeah, a lot of, I find that, for example, my students from China, who are a special group because they're coming to the US to study political science, are curious about, what they've heard about the US and curious about China, and they use the internet and the library and so on to find out things about their own country that they didn't know. But then I do not find that they're reflexively critical of China. They are reflexively, so it's people are complicated. So this particular slice of Chinese people, I think, are authentically puzzled, and they look at the American system, which, as I said before, doesn't work very well. And they look at the problems that they learn about things about their own system that they didn't know, and they find themselves kind of confused, and it was sort of tragic pathos that everything is bad everywhere. But that's a small slice. Then there are a lot of Chinese students at Columbia who are studying things like financial engineering and statistics and so forth. They're not particularly political. They came to get the degree. They came to go back. They're not going to sign a letter. They're not going to criticize anybody. And then I think the type of people who would put together 300 people signing a letter to criticize the decision on the South China Sea of the arbitral tribunal are people who are in some way connected to the regime. They may be scholars who've been sent overseas to study. They may be patriots. I think Chinese patriotism is very real. The Chinese media are widely available overseas. The Chinese story is available. The Chinese embassy and consulates in most places keep close touch with the China emigre community in most countries and so forth. I think it's a complicated and mixed picture. All right. Oh, Diana Fu from Canada. And where was it published? We should, yeah, okay. Maybe send me you have the paper in PDF? All right, I'd like to get a hold of that paper. But I think you're right that so the concept of losing face sounds like it's a special Chinese concept, but I think there is a reaction of let's say national identity, which is that if you are foreigner criticizing my country, it is my country after all, if I'm Chinese, or as an American. When I feel that people are, of course, I'm very critical of the United States, but so maybe I'm not a good example. Actually, I'm just very, very, very critical of the United States. But I think it's a natural reaction if some ignorant, stupid person criticizes your whole, like ethnic group that you identify with. You would, unless you're, quite sophisticated, you would feel a reaction to that. You're insulting me. It's my country. You're looking down on me, kind of thing. So I don't know that it's a specifically Chinese reaction, but I think there is this idea that Chinese people are not respected. I think a lot of Chinese people feel we're not respected. You think we're poor and backward. We're not poor and backward. We're actually pretty smart, kind of thing. So yeah, I think that's a good insight, and maybe to one of the reasons why some Chinese people would respond in that puzzling way. Although if the criticism is more sophisticated, I've found that then so if you can create an atmosphere of inquiry and dialogue, then Chinese people are happy to do that. But if you're just insulting them, then they feel insulted. I think that both the West and China have certain advantages. And academic freedom is one of the advantages of the West. And another advantage of the West, I think, is the startup economy, the entrepreneurial economy. Very great freedom for anybody to go out and sell a concept like AI, like ChatGPT, like whatever it is, like Facebook and so forth, and get venture capital and see whether that thing works. And China doesn't have such free entrepreneurship. The Chinese have the advantages that you mentioned. I mean, they're very smart. As I was saying, that most Chinese students at Columbia are studying, comp sci, financial engineering, and so on. They're not studying poli sci, and there are a lot of them. A disadvantage, and their amount of personnel that China has working on all of these things is more than we can possibly put in the field, because our populations are not as big. One of the disadvantages of China is the relative rigidity of their academic system, seniority, control by senior officials, and a problem of plagiarism, of falsification of data, which is not unique to China, but it seems to be a bigger problem in China. So both sides have advantages, and I'm glad that you're optimistic about the future of the West, and I hope you're right. And you're probably right, but I wouldn't dare to say who's going to win in the end. And it's probably going to be different for different technologies. AI is a technology that partly required, and I have no expertise, but obviously it partly requires the brain power of the programmers. It partly requires the vast amounts of data on which the programs are trained, which China has. But then it also requires a supply chain of rare earths and lithium and again, I forget the name of the other thing, that cadmium for the chips that process the AI. And China has a huge advantage in that supply chain at the present time. And then it requires the fabs for the supply chain, which are in Taiwan and the Netherlands. So, I mean, there are a lot of elements to this competition, and then there's competition in robotics, there's competition in bioengineering, there's competition in a number of different areas. So I don't know that we can generalize that anybody has a sort of advantage across the whole span of the competition.
On that note, please everyone join me in thanking Professor Nathan for his 2 lectures with us. Thank you very much. Wonderful. Yes, of course.